Hi, everyone. My name is Bobbi Farnsworth. I use she, they pronouns. I'm currently doing my clinical placement with Lifestone Counseling. They are an outpatient therapy clinic that focuses on adults with trauma, but I see people of all ages for all different sorts of issues. So, this is a real situation with some hypotheticals thrown in. Of course, all information has been de identified. So, this is my ethical dilemma presentation. Thanks for watching. So I'll start by introducing my client and the situation. So my client's name is Nathan. He is 14 years old. He lost his father about 1 year ago to cancer. So he has been engaging in individual therapy for about 9 months to cope with feelings of grief and anxiety. Nathan and I have excellent rapport, and he's doing well. So we're seeing overall symptom reduction and functioning improvement. Nathan disclosed to me that his mother has been drinking and driving while taking him to soccer practice after school. My colleague has been seeing Nathan and his mother, Jessica, as a family unit for about 6 months. They've been seeing my colleague to cope with the change in family structure since the loss of Nathan's father. Jessica had to disclose her drinking problem a few months ago and recently disclosed that she relapsed. Jessica also privately reported to her therapist that she dislikes me and she's looking for reasons to end Nathan's individual sessions. So, the ethical dilemma at hand is should I report the child endangerment posed by Jessica driving under the influence with Nathan present in the vehicle? So, now I must first decide the ethical decision framework for which I'll be using. Dolgoff and al. Reports that there are two primary decision frameworks: relativism and absolutism. Relativism states that what is right and wrong are based on social norms, and there are no universal moral absolutes, right? So, this allows for cultural consideration and weighs what decisions will yield the greatest overall good. Absolutism, on the other hand, states that there are fixed moral rules and believes there are inherent right and wrongs, regardless of the consequences, and should hold under all circumstances. While it is true that child endangerment is inherently wrong, which may lead us to believe that absolutism is the proper ethical decision framework for this decision, we are going to rely on relativism, and more will be explained when we consider policies and applicable laws to reporting child endangerment in Utah. The ethical principles in conflict in this scenario include the protection of life, because drinking and driving is really dangerous, and child endangerment is a felony offense, and least harm, right? Because there could be unintended consequences that result from state intervention, from Nathan being removed from his home, or even worse, right? It's also possible that if Jessica learns that I made the report, that she'll end Nathan's individual sessions, which could be really negatively impactful for Nathan's overall well being since he's been doing so well in individual therapy. This is an eco map that represents Nathan and Jessica's environment. So you can see there are several really strong bonds, such as church, friends, Jessica's job, and other family members. And for Nathan, therapy is one of those. But for Jessica and for Nathan and Jessica as a family unit, therapy is a little bit more strained. And then we have Nathan's father, who's recently deceased. So there's still some unresolved grief in that relationship. Nathan and Jessica share many cultural considerations with myself and my colleague, including our race and ethnicity, our language, and our citizenship status. Other things to consider include that Jessica is recently a widow and that Nathan is currently without a father figure. So their family dynamic is no longer nuclear. So that may be important as we address our personal biases. Okay, so policies and applicable laws when it comes to reporting child endangerment. So, according to Lifestone, my current clinical placement, it is up to clinician discretion, right? So, let's start with Utah laws. So, child endangerment is not equivalent to child abuse. and therefore it does not necessarily fall under mandatory reporting. However, there are things to be considered. And this is kind of where that clinical judgment comes in. So, some things to consider are, is this currently happening? Or was it disclosed as a past event? Right? Is the person who is reporting the endangerment a minor or an adult? And is there an ongoing risk of endangerment? So, when we consider Nathan and Jessica's situation, so this was disclosed as something that happened very recently or happened currently. The person who's reporting it is a minor, and there is an ongoing risk of endangerment. It's also worth noting that in Utah, child endangerment is a felony offense, and DCFS would require they would open an investigation. This does not mean that Jessica would be charged with child endangerment or that there would be legal consequences, but an investigation would likely be opened and evidence would attempt to be gathered. When assessing personal biases, the first thing that came to my mind was being aware of any emotional responses that are coming from me, knowing that Jessica expressed dislike for me and was looking for a reason to end Nathan's individual session. So I need to be sure that I am not responding or acting from an emotional place, right? Knowing that she expressed dislike for me. I need to examine my conscious and unconscious biases towards Jessica for endangering my client. And also knowing that I have a personal history of parents who suffer from alcoholism, right? I need to examine my personal privilege of being a childless person, of being a sober person. And that at this point in my life, I can only imagine the grief of losing a spouse and raising a child alone, right? I also need to assess my personal feelings about operating as state surveillance. This is something that I feel pretty uncomfortable about and is an ethical component of my work as a social worker, especially working with children. Dolgoff and others present this general decision making model, which is very basic. And we've all seen this, right? Kind of the seven basic steps that allow us to critically think about all of the possible decisions that we could make about this scenario. So I use this as a base model, right? So first we are identifying the problem and we're identifying all stakeholders that are involved in the problem. Or determining who should be involved in the decision making process, or identifying the values held by those stakeholders, or identifying the goals that would help to resolve the problem. You know, what do we hope to come from the decision? What do we imagine the best case scenario to be? We then identify alternative strategies and the potential consequences of those. We select and implement our strategy, and then we monitor and evaluate our decision. For this specific ethical dilemma, I chose to use the ethical principle screen, which, as you can see demonstrated, ranks the ethical principles from most important at the top of the pyramid to less important down at the bottom. So you can see protection of life is at the pinnacle of the pyramid. It is the most important thing that we need to do as social workers. And then you can see mid tier at the pyramid is least harm. So while still very important, protection of life takes precedence. After weeks of consultation between myself and my supervisor and my colleague, it was ultimately determined that the child endangerment did need to be reported. So we did so anonymously to DCFS. And it was also determined that in order to mitigate some of the potential consequences, such as Nathan being removed from therapy or harming the relationship between Jessica and Nathan, that it was not going to be documented and that all clinicians involved were going to deny allegations of reporting. So at this time, the outcome remains unknown. The report was filed anonymously, so DCFS will not follow up with us regarding a case number or potential outcome. So, the only way that we will become aware of the outcome is through client report. So we will wait to hear from them. Is there anything that we could have done differently or other things that we should have done? And the answer is yes, of course. There are so many different things that we could have done, right? We could have not reported at all, or we could have chosen to document the report, and each action would have had its own intended and unintended consequence. So, why did we end up making the choice that we did? Ultimately, we felt that the child endangerment was ongoing and it was of pressing concern, and that needed to be reported to fulfill our ethical and legal obligations and to prevent harm to Nathan, right? We chose to do so both anonymously and off the record to, reduce the risk of compromising the relationship between Nathan and his individual therapist, as well as between Nathan and Jessica, as that relationship was already strained. Did we miss anything? Personally, I feel uneasy about leaving the report undocumented, as accountability and transparency are important personal values. The ultimate goal of our intervention can be evaluated using the person in environment theoretical framework, right? So, if our intervention were to be completely successful, Jessica would have additional support by means of resources through DCFS. She would have psychoeducation needed to prevent child endangerment. She would understand how dangerous it is to drink and drive with a child present. She would have the ability to limit her substance use through education or perhaps a higher level of care. She may have access to increased coping skills for grief and parenting support. My three main takeaways that have just furthered my own understanding of professional and ethical behavior. So, number one, just as ethical conflicts are not black and white, neither are decisions or decisive actions, right? So, before consultation with my supervisor, my options were report child endangerment or don't. And then there was this third option, which was to report, but to leave it undocumented, to leave it off of the books. So it was almost some creative problem solving to mitigate some unintended consequences. Second, ongoing consultation is needed and expected. We would not have come to that solution without all three of us putting our heads together, right? And it took weeks for us to come to this decision. And finally, decisions will not always feel conclusive, and closure is not always possible, right? So, especially in outpatient or private practice, we may not know the outcome of our intervention ever. So that's why we need to rely on our clinical judgment and make the best choice that we can with the knowledge that we have, and just trust that even if the decision isn't perfect, we did our best to mitigate harm and we chose the best solution that we knew how to at this time in our career.